This is Art 364 Part 16, and we are in the middle of the 20th century. We're starting here with Henry Moore, who's English and a sculptor. The last sculptor that we saw was Auguste Rodin in the end of the 1800s, and he was the beginning of in sculpture of using sculpture as a abstraction as an expressive means. He was classically trained or academically trained, and he made sculptures, much of his career in the classical tradition. But the ones he's known for now are those where he departed from the classical tradition, and moving in the a little bit like one baby step in the direction of abstraction, that is distorting figures for expressive purposes. And here we are in the middle part of the century, and the next generation of sculptors. Also, Henry Moore was classically trained, or at least academically trained, and he also moved in the direction of abstraction, but further on, even more so than Rodin, because he was in the 20th century, influenced by Picasso and all the other artists of the first half of the 20th century, and they were the notion of moving away from academic tradition had become the norm, and the thing that was influencing most on Moore was the primitive artists. There was an example in painting in the first Picasso that we saw, the young women of Avignon, the African masks. That was the beginning of an interest by modern artists in primitive art, that is the art of primitive peoples around the world, because if you want to go away from the tradition, the normal Western civilization tradition of painting and drawing and sculpture, looking at different cultures, especially primitive cultures that had not had contact with the Western world, in what they did, that would be, in some sense, truer or more pure. Things that were unsullied by that tradition. So Moore here is an example of a Mayan work that he saw in the Louvre, and was taken with this as the kind of abstraction that he moved towards, and he over the course of many years, beginning with a style that was much more naturalistic, he moved in this sort of direction and came up with these kinds of forms. He had a long career, and he made quite a number of these sorts of very large figural sculptures that are very abstract, though you could always tell that they are a figure. The first one that I was showing you was a family group where is very recognizable. The female figure, the mother, a child, and father here sitting on a bench, are very appealing. They are abstracted, but they're abstracted in a way that unifies them all in this sort of roundness, the kind of roundness that you have with like the stone pebbles that are in a creek, where water flows over something and rounds it over and smooths it, creates an irregular but organic shape. All of the forms seem to fall in that category, yet there's very, very recognizably human still, and it's a very appealing, kind of warm, expressive group. But much of his works are like this. They're very large. They're for public spaces, usually architectural, in front of a building kind of work. And he would take these forms, again, the kinds of forms like it looks like stone that has been eroded with water flowing over it. So this rounded forms, often with penetrating holes, and the holes are not necessarily related to those that are part of the figure. That that he's sort of like having a mashup between what is a figure and what is a natural form that you might find in nature, the way nature maybe sculpts a stone using having water erosion. So we have these forms. You can see is definitely a head and shoulders here, and looks very much like an arm with an elbow here, and but this morphs into the lower the hip area, and this looks like a knee, and so this must be a thigh, and then this must be the lower leg, and this hole here must be the whole um, separating this leg from the other leg over there. But apart from that, you wonder, well, what is this hole about? This is sort of like the space of your arms that you make, but then you've lost the rest of the torso. So it's only some parts of the figure are there, and some are not. So it's much more abstracted than we'd seen before. Especially even with something like this. This doesn't have the holes, the penetrating form. This is uh, uh, much more recognizable. But this, became the main look for Henry Moore's sculptures, and he was very influential throughout the 20th century. Um, some of those follow Moore went in the direction of complete abstraction, as we've seen before, as happened in painting. Um, Moving on, back to painting and back to Picasso. We have this from 1937. It's called Guernica. It's the name of a town in Spain, in an area of Spain called the Basque region. It's a uh, uh, different society of Spanish that live up there. They have a different language. Um, this is a picture in the technique called synthetic cubism. The first cubism that we saw was called analytical cubism, where you take forms and you break them into little pieces. Synthetic is when you build them back up, starting with pieces, um, and they're often flat. What we think of as collage, where you cut out pieces of paper of different textures and colors and put them together into a picture. That collage, that is synthetic cubism. This painting, though, has a story behind it. First of all, it's very large. It's 25.5 feet wide, so it's of a giant scale, like the kind of scale that the history paintings in the academic tradition would be like. Except it's obviously very different from those in many other respects. This was a painting that was commissioned by Spain. In Spain, there were, in the 30s, a lot of political upheavals. There were two main factions. The one that was in charge were the fascists, who were on the side of the Nazis, and the Italy and Germany were allied together as the fascist group, and they were allied with the rulers of Spain. And there was another sort of an anti-fascist group that was called the Republicans, who were the resistance. Those people are the one who commissioned this from Picasso, and they did it in the beginning of 1937 in order to have so that it could be in the Spanish pavilion of the Paris World Fair. There was a World Fair exhibition that was going to be in 1937 later in the year, and they were going to have a Spanish pavilion. So Picasso was going to paint something to commemorate Spain, since even though he was living in Paris, he was Spanish. He started working on it, and later in the year, in April, there was an event occurred in Spain where the Republicans, that is the people who were the resistance against the rulers in Spain, who were in the Basque country and in Guernica, they were bombed by the German Air Force. That is, the Germans were sort of asked by the fascists in Spain to bomb this area. For one reason was because they contained the resistance, but also because the German Air Force needed a sort of a practice run for their what was going to be developed into Blitzkrieg for World War II, which was going to be happening shortly thereafter. So you can imagine this small or rural village in northern Spain made up of kind of a primitive people who were not in the mainstream of society, who were just bombed because uh, that's what the fascists did. But it was the expression that Picasso is doing here is that these are completely innocent people who were just being bombed for no reason, and so he's depicting the horror of the event. And this is, when he decided to do it for this exhibition, so he made a gigantic picture, like 25 feet wide, and he started painting it, and even had a photographer come and take pictures of him as he's taking as he's drawing the thing, so as to get a record of the making of it as a historical event, the making of this picture. And it became a historical event, the whole making of it and the presentation of it. And it went on a world tour. It was more than just commemorating an event, a war atrocity, but just, I guess, a statement of an anti-war statement in general about man's humanity against man. So what we're looking at, imagery, it seems to be, even though it's broken up and is hugely abstract, you can still make out lots of things in the picture. There's a horse right in the middle, and the horse seems to be screaming. You can see that his tongue is made into like a dagger shape, a triangular shape, pointing out like he's screaming. And his body is so distorted, and there's a spear sticking in him. There's the spear, and the point is sticking out, and his legs are all contorted, and the form of his body is not rendered in any kind of tone to show three-dimensional shape. It's just made up of facets and flat textures, which would look kind of like newspaper stuck, as if you'd cut out pieces of paper and glued them onto the surface. Over on the left, you see a bull. There's the back end of the bull and the front end of the bull. It had been changed at some point. Here's a drawing, earlier drawing, where you can see the bull is in this orientation, and then he, at some point in the process, he changed it to the other orientation because he was working on it in front of someone taking pictures of it at different stages. So there's a bull also with a dagger. And there's a woman here with also a dagger mouth. She's screaming, and she's holding a dead baby. Apparently, this is a mother whose baby was killed by this bombing event that is happening. There's a soldier's head is broken off as if it were a statue, with dismembered arms over here and some other arm over here, with holding a broken sword. On this side, there's a woman who's sticking her head into the window, also with a scream on her face in disbelief, holding a kerosene lamp. There's an electric light over here with a light bulb, and the light is represented as daggery kind of shapes, zigzaggy shapes, similar to the screaming tongues. There's another woman who's running in from this side, and with her arms down in a kind of a gesture of disbelief. And another woman who's just sort of flying through the air, and you can see she also has these dagger shapes which indicate fire, like she's on fire, and her arms are up in the air, and she's also screaming. The building itself apparently is on fire. This is a texture indicating the roof. And there's other lines indicating this is kind of an interior space with a wall here in a corner. Other things that are on the floor, just a cacophony of shapes. And they're all rendered in shades of gray, black and white and gray. And the reason for that is that the news of this event came to Picasso through newspaper pictures. That is, he would read about this event that was occurring in the newspapers, and there would be black and white photos, like this one, showing what a town in his country had suffered this horrible devastation. So with these black and white images, and in imagining what would be like in the home of one of these, kind of a peasant village, of these people who are just have no idea what's going on or why anything is happening. They may not even be very aware of planes and bombs at all, until it's just like the end of the world for them. So he's taken a formal approach that involves lots of straight lines and jaggedness, a repetition of the zigzag lines here, so as to indicate the kind of forms that you naturally feel as sharp and dangerous, and the angles and everything of everything looks, and the kinds of ways that everything is distorted is to give you or causing you an emotional response of sympathy for these people, and that these are, the things that are happening to these people are the things that could happen and have happened to lots of people throughout the history of the world in the course of wars where just unjust things occur, and just the horror of this sort of event. Here's some, he did a lot of preparatory drawings. The screaming woman's face. And notice that the way the way the lines are drawn, the energy that they have are all to amplify the scream, the emotional effect of it. And he does this just quick quick swirls and angular things, and it feels as though you can imagine yourself making these marks, and those marks are so made so quickly, so fast, as if the artist is experiencing this emotion and wanting to pour it into the drawing. It's a study for the horse. And the woman with the baby. This one has more detail than the actual the painting has, but he's working out ways to represent something so as to distill it down to its essence. Look back at that figure here, so that you just have almost like a cartoon or a caricature of a Madonna and child, that the normal form of a Madonna and child, distorted to the point where you can feel it. You can feel what's going on with it. Okay, so that's in the 30s. All right, now we're going to move to something completely different. Grant Wood's and the American Gothic. This is a painting, because the 20th century is big. There's lots of stuff, and there's a huge variety of things that occur. Lots of different movements, art movements. Some of them are formalized in groups who have manifestos, and others are just single artists who are working out visual problems in one way or another. But they're all aware of what's going on. That is, they're all aware of there's the previous century's academic tradition, and there's much of the population of the art public are people who are expecting still the academic tradition, and since many of the major artists at the top end, the people most aware of, have abandoned the tradition, having someone come and produce something that appears, superficially at least, to be part of that tradition is ironic. It seems completely out of place. This is a painting. It seems perfectly normal, given all the things that we've seen so far. This is it's called American Gothic, which is a reference to the uh, the architectural style of this building. In the background, there's a regular Iowa farmhouse, and the farmhouse has a Gothic window in it. And Grant Wood was driving through Iowa, saw this house, and remarked that it is kind of odd having this small, flimsy wooden frame house has a Gothic window, which you associate with Gothic cathedrals, and it just seems a kind of an incompatible thing. So he drew a picture of it, and went home and thought, he wanted to paint a picture of this building, and he wanted to put in the picture the sort of people who would live in it, and he used as models his sister, this woman here, and his dentist. That's his dentist there. And there's the actual people who posed for this picture are posing in front of the picture. You notice that he actually looks remarkably like the person in the picture. If you look at his face and you look at his face, it looks pretty much like the same guy. But she looks a little different. When you look at her face and you look at the face here, it's like he's distorted the face to a certain amount. Like she seems to have a kind of a squarish jaw, and the top of her hair is very different. But he's made her hair, her head shaped more oval-like. And uh, when you look at the picture, well, there's a reason. He's using formal elements. Like this shape that her head is. Well, it's the same sort of shape that his head is in. So he's unifying a picture by repeating the same shape. Like this little brooch on her dress is also in that same shape, and it's repeated in this angle right, or this arc right here, and also in the tree back behind her head, so that her head, which is close to us, and something that's very far away from us, have two formal elements that are the same, so that this echoes this, and by doing so, it flattens the picture out. So he's actually using, uh, 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 apparently consciously using formal elements to unify the picture, the same way that Picasso was using in Cubism, though he's doing it within what appears to be the normal academic tradition of realism, where you can see everything looks visually like you would normally see it. But he has a pitchfork here, and the pitchfork shape is repeated in his clothes right there, that shape, and you sort of see that things line up. His mouth, it kind of lines up with there, and um, there's interesting phenomenon going on in this picture that are beyond simply what you would get if you just took a snapshot of two people standing in front of a house. And apparently you can still do that. If people do that, the house still exists. There it is. This is what it looks like. The house in the painting, made in the 30s, the house is still there, and you can go stand in front of it with your own pitchfork and have your picture made in front of it. But what Grant Wood has done, uh, he's made what has become an iconic image. When it was first made, he entered into a contest for the Art Institute of Chicago, and it won like a bronze star or something, and they bought it for like $300, and it's part of the Art Institute of Chicago's collection now. And initially, the response by the avant-garde, the people, I don't know, the people who were big in the upper echelon, the elites of the art world, saw it, praised it, because as if it were a spoof of the backwards American rural life, the kind of attitude that these sort of people would have who live in the country, and those people are what they now call flyover country. But later, a different attitude towards the painting came up, where it's instead of being a spoof or a parody of these people, that it is actually a heroic image. That this is representing that all of those good qualities of the people of Middle America, and that was something that Grant Wood uh, encouraged, that interpretation of it. So that's American Gothic. And here's a more typical picture by Grant Wood. This is one of his landscapes, and uh, you can see that as an artist, he's very much into abstraction. I mean, you can see that you can recognize all of the things in here, but this is very far removed from the real world. And if you could look back at there, you can see, he does some of that back in these trees here. It's just otherwise the picture looks perfectly naturalistic. But this was his normal uh, style of drawing. Okay, one more step into something completely different. This is Jackson Pollock. Um, there was a movement that occurred after the war uh, where there was a shift in the art world between having Paris as the center to having New York as the center. And in New York, the artists there are variously called abstract expressionists, where abstraction was a big thing, especially completely non-representational art. And there were many different flavors of abstract expressionism, and this is one of the flavors. Pollock uh, developed a kind of painting called what others called action painting, uh, where he just dripped painting on the canvas. I forgot. Uh, well, I forgot to put it on there, but I have here a. I can't find it right now. Sorry. Anyway, a picture of Jackson Pollock actually doing this. A picture, imagine that this is a painting where the canvas is put on the floor and the artist stands over it with a bucket of like house paint and sticks the paintbrush in until he gets a whole bunch of paint on it and just sort of strings it around and lets it drip onto the surface. And as you see, and this is a very large picture, by the way, uh, this has a great deal of drips and spatters of paint. There's just I think three colors. There's the raw canvas color, black and white, and this sort of tannish color. And notice that they're sort of interwoven, so that it's not like he just did one color and then did another color on top. You can see that some are on top and others are on top in different places. Uh, so he's consciously weaving the thing all together. Um, this brings together several. Oh, it's also composed. I mean, it's not just a random sampling of canvas. I mean, as you see that it stops over here, it peters out towards the edges, so that the thing that is made, the figure, I guess you could call it, is all contained within this rectangle. And this contains the notion that of say where you making paintings where you're not thinking about it. That is, you're going through your subconscious, like the biomorphs of Miro, or Malevich or Kandinsky. The um, the making forms, putting canvas on a surface where you're not using your conscience. You're um, just letting it flow. And so taking that a step further, where you're not even physically putting the paint on the canvas directly with a paintbrush like you would with any other paint in the history of art, where you actually dab it onto the surface, just letting it fall and letting it drip and letting it spatter, uh, so that there's even less connection between you and it, and that it's just completely spontaneous um, um, frenzy, I guess you could say. Uh, uh, Someone who came to photograph Pollock doing one of these pictures, described him. He said he just went into a kind of a frenzy where he just started putting paint on this surface, completely ignoring anything around him, and was just completely involved in the act of making this sort of thing. And what you have in consequence. When you take it, you stretch it on a stretcher, and you put it on a wall, and you stand in front of it, you look in this field of textures, and they're all filled with a kind of a busy energy to them, and it just seems uh, like an infinite space, a different like a different world, and you would you would expect, and it would be right, if you think that the reception of this was not good universally. Many people thought, well, anyone can do that. In fact, many art students think that, and they try. It's not that easy to make a unified picture, something that actually expresses anything by using this technique. And it took Pollock quite a long time of moving in this direction from where he started, because he was trained essentially in an academic manner. Thomas Hart Benton was his teacher, and he has drawings, he has paintings, and he moved through different movements before he finally ended up with this. The next artist is also abstract expressionist. In this case, this is Mark Rothko. He was a Jewish Russian immigrant from the early part of the 20th century, lived in the United States, and went through a process of learning art in the academic sense, but also in the sense of learning all of the different styles of the different movements that were going on in the early 20th century. Went through surrealism, Dadaism, all of the isms that occurred. He would try this and that, and it was constantly moving in the direction until he came up with these color field pictures. These are characterized. Let's look at three of them real quick, just so you can see the kind of pattern what we're dealing with. They are kind of largish, usually 5 or 6 feet tall. You tend to have 2 or 3 colors, sometimes more, but usually there's a background color and there's one big rectangular shape, at least one. Sometimes there's 2 divided in half, and this one is divided with another color. Here there's just 3 patches of color on a background, and here there's a patch of color here. There's a little skinny patch here, but you can see that as they're not hard edged. All the edges are very, very soft, and all the colors are not painted purely. They are made up of lots and lots of thin layers of color, and you can imagine that the artist has gone to some effort to calibrate the colors. That is, he changing them subtly from one to another to make it a little warmer, a little cooler, a little greener, a little bluer, whatever, until he gets a combination of colors that sing together. Now, Rothkos are entirely impossible to appreciate at all in reproductions. They are extremely subtle things to look at, and they're impossible to photograph. Looking at this image on my screen here, I could wonder, if this is your first, this is your introduction to Mark Rothko, you might ask, what's this about? And honestly, I can't communicate to you because I can't show you what it is about them that is special at all. But when you go to a museum and you see original Rothkos, it is an experience to be in front of them. You're looking at pure color, and your eyes, looking at these colors, experience things that you don't see in looking at any other kinds of works. Colors sometimes vibrate. They will, as you look at them and stare at them for a long time, you start getting all sorts of weird optical properties that occur. But you just have to take my word for it. It's all about it's all about just the experience of seeing the originals, and there's not a lot you can say that you can express to someone what it is that comes from it. Um, there's a chapel in Houston called the Rothko Chapel, and it's a church-like space, sort of octagonal with a very high ceiling, and it has maybe a dozen or so very large, maybe 15-foot tall Rothkos, and they're all this kind of composition, except it's basically black colors painted on top of black. So just an extremely subtle difference between the figure black and the ground black. But you look at them, and it is a very calming kind of setting, and it's more about the emotional response you have to them, or the optical response you have to them, than any other kind of thing that you might express verbally. Okay, another movement within the 20th century, beginning in the mid-50s and going through the 60s, is called pop art. And I have three artist examples of pop art, and that will end our survey of the 20th century. Though much more art was made in this period, and even after, between the 60s and now, there's quite a lot of art. But as far as a survey of art history goes, it's much harder to decide, well, what's going to be what is historical. I mean, because there's so much art. I mean, there's millions of works of art. So how do you choose which are the ones that are important in some sort of historical sense? It's like it's easy to go back into, say, the 1600s and pick Rembrandt. Yes, of course, Rembrandt, and Vermeer, and Hals. Though at the end of the 1600s, nobody knew those people. They were forgotten, and they had to be resurrected. Some, more than 100, maybe sometimes 200 years later, and we don't know now, looking at works from 50 years ago, or even 25 years ago. We don't know who is going to be the ones that are going to be remembered, who's going to be forgotten, and who are completely unknown now, but later will be discovered. We just don't know. So because of that, in this survey, we're not going to look at everything, but ones that may, stand the test of time. This one is by Andy Warhol, and Andy Warhol had a big career out of these kinds of things. This is an example of what's called pop art. Pop art is a reaction against abstract expressionism. It is sort of an intellectual exercise where you look at the society, look at the culture that we come from, and kind of look at it as almost as a kind of a disdain. The culture that the pop culture of the United States, and also Britain as well, it began in Britain, is filled with mass-produced objects. Things like graphic arts, like the kinds of things that are on the labels of food cans. The boxes of cereal, the kind of stuff that's just throwaway, mass-produced things that are just mass-produced. You're ubiquitous. Your world is filled with these sorts of things, and many of the pop artists would look at this stuff and think, taking it out of the context of, say, the grocery store, or the newspaper, or the comic book, and putting it and making a painting of it, or making a large image of it, and putting it in a museum in a kind of an ironic way, in a way of saying we're taking something that isn't art and putting it in the context as if it's art. That's for the essence of pop art. And one way of looking at it is raising something that is ordinary up to a higher level, is one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that it's taking down what is the things that are in museums that are thought of as art, like the academic tradition. Think of them taking those and tearing them down by putting something that is ordinary in its place. Whichever way you look at it, this is an image of Marilyn Monroe, who's a popular movie star from the late 50s, early 60s, and she was uh, this is her publicity photo, and Warhol, who was a graphic designer and a commercial artist, he took her picture and made a silkscreen image from it. That is, you take a photographic negative, and you burn it onto a screen printing device, and you print it onto a surface. One of the he is something that you do to make a mass-produced object, and if you're going to make a comment about mass production, using mass production methods is a way to illustrate that. So he's taken her image and made it 50 times, reproduced it 50 times onto this image, the left half. This is called a diptych, by the way, which is a term for, in the academic tradition, the normal art historical tradition, is a painting that has two sides, two main sides. Usually they fold it half, and they're usually a religious art where there's some sort of devotional image. So by just calling it a diptych is a way to reference and perhaps at the same time belittle tradition. What he's done is, when you take a photograph and you separate out the different colors, that is, you make a screen of the color of the hair, you make a screen of the color of the face, a screen of the color of the lips, and a screen that is the black, the main black and white image. And you can put any color you want, and once you put the screen on top of the surface and you put ink on it, and you pull the squeegee across, and it puts the image on, and then you do that several times with the different colors. But each kind of slightly different. They're not exactly the same as one another. This is a reference to this actress being made, being mass produced. Her image is reproduced many times, and this is her glamour shot. And then if you take the same image, the same screen that you had with the just the black, and you load it with ink, and you squeegee it down, and then without adding any more, if you continue to squeegee it, the ink gets less and less, so it sort of fades away. And I guess you did that several times to get different effects throughout, showing her that the image behind her, is fading away. Whatever meaning, symbolic meaning you get with that, is expressed in this. This one is thought of as the main pop art image. That is the iconic version of expressing what pop art expresses. Ruscha is another pop artist, but this one, Warhol worked mostly in New York, but he's a Southern California artist. I believe he's still living. He did the same sorts of things, where taking images and especially typography, in this case, the word standard, which refers to Standard Oil, and in the 60s that was a brand of gas station. But in this case, what he's doing, he's actually making a composition with it. He's taking the perspectival image of a gas station, so that the vanishing point being over here causes everything to line up over here. All these lines continue over here, and he's using that as a way to flatten the picture by having it go over to the upper left corner. So as you have this big black square representing nighttime, and this gas station probably illuminated by fluorescent lights, and has big searchlights coming out here to create other diagonal lines. So he's using formal elements to compose a picture, but at the same time he's making a kind of a statement about the ubiquity of this kind of art, the architecture, the design, the formal design of all of these, gas pumps and how they're arranged, and just the dynamicness of this kind of look, and this big sign here with the typography on it. All these things are part of uh, the graphic world we live in, and he's using those and putting them together, to make a statement about the society you live in. Our last one is Roy Lichtenstein, who's an artist who his thing is to take images from comic books, or the kind of like in the funny papers, in the newspapers used to print comics, and in those comics there were often serialized, drama series as well. And so he would take images from those, and take a single image, something that would be, distill the story down into one picture, and he would reproduce it, you know, in a large oil painting, and he would reproduce even down to what's called the Ben-Day dots. When these comics, the way they were printed, there would be one pass where they would print the black here, but the colors, in order to get multiple colors, which they're only going to print it, the thing is only going to run through a press a number of times, just for each color. So you can run through for the yellow and for the black and for the blue, but to get this skin tone, what he's done is, or what they would used to do, is they would have these screens of dots, and they would use those to print uh, uh, a lighter version of a color. So you could, uh, uh, because there are dots, you would have the white mixed in with that, and so when the dots are closer together, as they are here, you have a little bit purer version of that color than you have it over here. But this is a mechanical printing process, and the artist here has taken that mechanical printing process and reproduced it painstakingly by hand, so as to give the look of that mechanical process. If you look here, you can see even the same. If this had been printed in a comic of some sort, the pass that would create this red here was probably the same pass that created that. But by having this reversed out, then this color becomes a darker version of that same color. Includes typography that the comic would have, and it also has the face, the style of that comic. But again, this is an example of one aspect of pop art, where you taking something from the pop culture and bringing it up to the level of a painting. In this case, by reproducing it as a painting. Okay, so that concludes the survey.